A B-1 pilot made a $456 million mistake when he was trying to land and touch down 100 feet short of the runway, skidding across the ground as all 4 crew members ejected. The truth is that this pilot wasn't the only one to blame for what happened, and that's why we're going to talk about the mistakes that were made and take a full look at the accident investigation report. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. For those of you that aren't familiar with this mishap, this took place back on January 4th this year, and the Air Force just released a 58-page accident investigation report. That's, a lot of shocking details about what went wrong, but also how all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up, leading to this crash. And as some of you might know, when I was in the Air Force, one of my last jobs that I did was the Wing Chief of Safety at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. So the safety investigation process is something that I'm very familiar with. And kind of looking at that process, comparing it to how the NTSB does things is one of the things that got me so interested in doing these debriefs, and really one of the reasons why I started the channel, trying to get these lessons out there. Before we dive into this, there's a couple things that I wanted to share with you, though. If you're watching this on the replay, this is not a regular debrief video. This is a live stream, so I'm going to be prone to making some mistakes from time to time. It's not going to be as polished as my other videos, but it's still going to be in a similar format that most of the other videos are on the channel. And I'm going to try to keep it as efficient as possible. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll try to get to them, but if I don't, then I'll go ahead and cover those at the end and save a lot of those for the end if I need to. And if you're watching this on the replay, if you have questions, drop them in the comments below, and I'll go back afterwards and go over all of that. Now, all that being said, in order to understand how this happened, it's important to have a little bit of understanding of the Air Force safety investigation process and the board that's responsible for creating this report. The Air Force Safety Center website has a lot of this information if you want to dig into the weeds on it. But overall, the summary of it is whenever there's a mishap in the Air Force, whether it's aviation related or an occupational health issue, and a job injury, that sort of thing, they're going to classify those mishaps from Class A through Class E. A Class A mishap, which is what this is going to be something that involves a fatality, a permanent disability, destruction of an aircraft, basically things that cost a lot of money or result in loss of life. And Class E is way down at the opposite end, so things that cost less than about $25,000 or something. I think that's the number for that. Now, when you have a Class A mishap, a serious mishap like this B-1 crash, what's going to happen first is they're going to start an interim safety board, and that's going to be comprised of individuals that are safety trained on the base that's closest to where the incident happened. And usually it's going to be, chaired by like a 06, so a colonel or maybe lieutenant colonel from the base. And then they're going to have some different members there. And the important part that they do is they collect and preserve all the initial evidence, and they're going to take witness statements and things like that. And in the meantime, while that's going on, the Air Force is putting together through the higher headquarters a safety investigation board. Now, the safety investigation board is really looking at the root causes and lessons learned type of thing, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But the other thing that is going to run concurrently sometimes is the accident investigation board. So there's really two separate components to a mishap. You're not always going to have an accident investigation board, but you will always have a safety investigation board when you have a mishap of this magnitude. The SIB, it's a little bit different than how the NTSB runs things. Their sole purpose is mishap prevention, kind of like the NTSB. Root cause and recommendations is what they're after, but they operate very quickly. And so, that report should come out not long after the mishap happened, usually a few months afterwards. But the big thing is it's safety privilege. So you're not going to see that report anywhere online. You're not going to be able to find it, and it stays within the DoD community. And it's going to be actually exempt from disclosure outside of the DoD safety community. And so you can't do a FOIA request for these or anything like that. It's completely non-punitive, and they don't want to punish anybody. Really, what they're getting after is why did this happen and how can we prevent it from happening again, which I think is probably one of the most important things there. The Accident Investigation Board, completely separate. You have to remember it's a legal investigation. It is a public report. So that's what we're looking at for this. And it usually is involved or contributes to potential disciplinary action when it comes to what happened. This report, 58 pages long. The accident happened in January, so we're only about 7 months later. So I like the fact that they get these out pretty quickly and they go through and figure out what happened much faster, I think, in some cases than what the NTSB does. The aircraft that was involved in the crash, obviously, you've got the B-1B Lancer, nicknamed Bone. So B-1 spells out bone, and kind of that's where that came from. It's a supersonic variable sweep wing aircraft. It's a heavy bomber used by the Air Force. These things can carry a lot of bombs, about 84 500-pound bombs or 24 2,000-pound bombs. And according to the Accident Investigation Board, there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft at the time of the crash. So the next thing they want to start looking at is the crew that were flying it on that day. The crew for the aircraft consists of 2 pilots. You've got an aircraft commander and a co-pilot that are sitting up front. And this is just a stock photo from the Air Force site here, showing you kind of what those displays look like that they have available to them. So they've got, pretty high-tech equipment available to them, but a little bit different in how they operate this aircraft when it comes to flying an instrument approach compared to how an airliner would fly that approach, which we'll get into in a minute here. Behind those 2 pilots, you're going to have 2 combat systems officers. You've got a defensive and an offensive officer. Now, you can kind of see in this picture here, this hole in the middle. The big thing is they don't have visibility out at the front of the aircraft. They each have a small window on their respective sides. They play a very vital role in the mission. The B-1 couldn't do the mission without them. But, the big thing here is the crew coordination is going to be crucial when working with the pilots up front, because they're not in direct line of sight of each other, and they're not able to look out the front of the aircraft to see what's going on. So that's going to be something that's going to play a role in what happened here. Just real quickly, the offensive systems officer, he began flying in 2015. He's got over 1,000 hours, and he was a weapons instructor course graduate in 2022. This is the course that's out at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, where it's basically the Air Force Weapons School. So he's kind of the top, one of the top instructors, if not the top instructor in the squadron, and has a fair amount of experience. Over on his left, you've got the defensive system officer who started flying the B-1 in 2020. He's got about 368 hours. Now, the one thing that the Accident Investigation Board does is when they start looking at these individuals, as soon as they start seeing a thread, they're going to start pulling on it to figure out what else they can find and what else they can dig up from that individual's past, or how those human factors might have contributed to the mishap that we're looking at. In this case, from his training records, they discovered that his most recent flight, was a couple weeks prior to the accident. So he flew right before the Christmas break. But they said that during his initial qualification course, they noted negative trends, including not backing up pilots with airspeed, altitude, and cross checks during the landing phases of the flight. Now, the one thing I want to say about this, and this is, when you're looking at this Accident Investigation Board, you're like, man, that's kind of crazy that he wasn't doing this, and they made a big deal out of this. But that initial qualification course that he did was almost 3 years prior to the mishap. So that means he's done with his initial qualification. He went on to do a mission qualification in the squadron, and now he's been flying on a regular basis. And to be honest, if somebody went back and looked at my initial qualification records from the F-15E, they'd see, things that I messed up back then as well. So I don't necessarily think this is like a huge deal, but it's something that the AIB is looking at when they're looking at this from a holistic nature in terms of, everybody that was involved and how that might have contributed to what happened in this mishap. Up front, you've got an instructor pilot, and it's not clear which seat he was sitting in. I'm assuming he was maybe in the right seat because this was an upgrade flight for the other pilot, but it's not sure. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter which seat he was in. This guy's been flying for over 15 years. He's an instructor. He's also an evaluator. And if you're not familiar with that, the evaluators in the Air Force, they're basically like line check airmen. So he's an individual that's responsible for giving check rides and evaluations to other pilots in the squadron. He's got a couple thousand hours, only 2 flights within the last 30 days. And I think part of that is because you've got the Christmas holiday break that happened right before this mishap. The mishap pilot himself, he began flying in 2021, finished his mission qualification in the squadron in August of 22. He's only got about 250 hours. And essentially, he's the least experienced member of this crew. So when you're looking at it, comparatively speaking, he's got a guy, 15 years his senior sitting next to him in the cockpit. And they didn't really address whether that might have contributed to this. I think it did. And you're going to see why as we get a little bit further into the details about what happened right before they actually crashed. Now, the mishap pilot, again, they went back and looked at his records as well, and they saw that during his initial qualification training, when he was first training on the B-1, as well as when he went through his mission qualification training, there was a lot of instructor comments about him having a history of unstable approaches, early transitioning to visual during flying on ILS, shifting aim points, excessive power pulls. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but this was a upgrade ride for him where I think it was the second ride in this upgrade in terms of him becoming an aircraft commander and a single ship mission lead on the B-1. One of the things that they looked at also, they're going to pull the blood and do all the medical stuff right after this happened. So the toxicology was negative. All 4 crew members were able to eject from the aircraft, but the instructor pilot was injured during the ejection. And that's one of the things they looked at these and realized they ejected after they were on the ground. So it's an ACES 2 ejection seat, which is the seat that's used in most fighter aircraft in the Air Force. And he was rendered, the instructor pilot was rendered unconscious during that ejection, but the rest of the crew is fine. And when they started figuring out, okay, well, how did this happen? How did he get injured? What they found is that ejection seat has a limit of 211 pounds, and it was adjusted to 245. And they use that term adjusted, but I think what they're really meaning is the Air Force can waive your weight up to 245 pounds, and so you can still fly in the aircraft. And what they discovered was that the instructor pilot weighed 260 pounds. And they concluded that was most likely the sole reason why he was the only one that got injured and was rendered unconscious during the mishap. And the reason why I think this is important is because it kind of demonstrates a little bit of the culture of the organization, allowing things to slide, just one little thing here, one little thing there, and things start to change over time. And we talked about this in the Dallas Air Show mishap, how you have a normalization of deviance, how that is ultimately going to put you down this path where a mishap is going to be more likely to take place. So that's something that whether you're in a flying organization or not, it's very important to understand from a safety risk management standpoint how these things can happen without you really thinking about them. They just kind of creep up on you over time. And I also just want to say that this isn't necessarily me trying to point the finger at any one individual when it comes to this mishap. There is a collective responsibility in terms of, making safety our number one goal. And it's easy to say, okay, well, it was your fault or it was this guy's fault and this is what happened. But that's not what we want to do. We want to walk through this investigation and the take away the key lessons that we can, so that way we can make them, make everyone safer in the future, regardless of what type of aircraft you're flying or what you're doing. Before we dive into the plan, I want to say a couple other things here. If you want to be part of the discussion about these mishaps, or if you want to be one of the first ones to find out when these NTSB reports are available, and this is kind of where I started catching on to some of these things, is join our Discord community. And I'm just going to make a plug for that. And if you're not familiar with Discord, we're going to have the NTSB preliminary and final reports on there. And Adam, who runs the Facebook page Aviation Accidents and Incidents, he uploads all of those on there. So, and you can actually see the B-1 in the photo down here. So you would just go on Discord, you could click on it and you can comment on it, ask questions, and then I answer questions in there from time to time as well, and engage with folks. So it's a great place, and you can join for free. Doesn't cost anything. We also have other chat rooms you can look at on the Discord server there. The one thing I would say is, you know, yeah, you got a QR code so you could scan it there. I forgot what I was going to say. All right. Also, if you want to support the channel, and this is a question I got asked a lot when I was out at Oshkosh, there's 3 different ways. I'll just mention those real quickly. If you want to support the channel, go to the channel page, click on join, or you can click the join button below the video. And this is different than subscribing to the channel. One of the main benefits of doing so is you're going to get first access to all my videos before they're available to the public. So I've already uploaded tomorrow's video. So channel members get to be the first ones to watch that and comment on it. And I'm going to prioritize responding to their comments on those videos. And then another option, if you don't like doing the YouTube channel thing, is you can join me on Patreon. You're also going to get early access to the videos. And then all those videos are ad-free on Patreon. If you don't want to do either of those, then the third option, you can go to pilotdebrief.com and you can check out some of the cool gear that I have on there. And I really appreciate your support for all that. All right. Now let's talk about the plan for this. And also, for those of you who aren't aware, I've got Sticks in the background. He dropped a comment in the chat. He's helping me manage this today. Sticks, I've got this little thing here on the screen. If you could help me get rid of it. I'm not sure what's going on there. But when it comes to the plan starts, on the day of the brief, right? They show up on January 4th, and you've got mission planning that's going to start at 900. Then you're going to have, right after that, they've got an 11 o'clock briefing, a 12:10 step time, a 14:30 scheduled takeoff time, 16:27 is the sunset, and 18:15 is the land time. Now, this is a long day. And one of the things that you have to realize is, this is pretty much their entire day. So from an Air Force officer perspective, if you're wanting to get any sort of administrative stuff done, you've got to do it early in the morning, or it's going to be late at night, or try to do it on another day, because even though they're landing at 18:15, that was the planned time, they're probably not going to get back in to actually debrief. They're not going to get back to the squadron until almost 1900, debrief starting at 2000 maybe. And so they're not out of there till 9 or 10 o'clock at night in a good scenario. So that's just something that you need to keep in mind there, is the duty day is going to, in my opinion, play a role in this, even though they ended up concluding that crew rest was not a factor when it came to what happened in this accident. So they show up at 9 o'clock, they get all their mission planning done, and now they go into their briefing at 11 o'clock. And they're going to have 2 B-1s, so Felon 01 and Felon 02. And they're briefing as a 2-ship. So that means there's 8 people in the briefing room together, and Felon 02 is the mishap aircraft. Now, that briefing, it's supposed to be an hour long. They know from, witness statements that 15 minutes of that briefing was dedicated to admin, or what's sometimes referred to as the motherhood. And I've actually made a briefing guide that kind of covers that from the GA perspective that you can find on my website. But that admin briefing, that kind of sets all the standards and the expectations for getting out to the airspace and back, the training rules, things like that. And one of the very first parts of that briefing is going to be your weather and NOTAMs, because you kind of need to know what the weather is going to do before you go fly your mission for the day. And we know that when they showed up that morning, the weather was 200 to 400 foot sea lanes, and they had about 1 to 2 miles of visibility because of mist that was throughout the area. But the weather forecaster was saying, hey, this is probably going to burn off throughout the day. So when that briefing started at 11 o'clock, that was kind of their understanding of the weather. I don't know that they had a really good read on what the weather was probably going to do by the time they landed, but essentially it was looking like it was going to be maybe pretty decent by the time they landed. While they're in their briefing, a mission execution forecast was updated and issued at 11:27 local. Now, this is a product that's specifically prepared by the weather shop that's supporting that unit or supporting the base, and it's going to have the weather specific to your takeoff and landing, as well as what the weather is doing out there. Because for a bomber or a fighter guy, you need to know if you're going to be able to see the target. So that's kind of important. So that it's going to have a lot of that information in there. And what that report said, that was by the time they come back to land, it's going to be a 1,500-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility. Now that they've got that, some of that information, the other thing they needed to brief was the NOTAMs. And this is going to be a huge factor in this. And I know that NOTAMs are sometimes a pain to read through because there could be so many of them. And they're a pain to brief in terms of a fighter squadron, but you have to review them, especially when you're on a bad weather day. Because on 18 December, about 2 weeks before the mishap, there was a NOTAM issued that increased the minimum visibility required for runway 13 from a half mile to 3/4 of a mile. So it's definitely something that is going to impact your ability to safely take off or land. And my guess is that the guys probably weren't paying that much attention to it because of the Christmas break. And they didn't really say whether some of these pilots, if this was their first flight after the Christmas break, or if they had already done, 1 or 2 flights. Again, this happened on January 4th. So my guess is, this NOTAM drops probably while some of these guys are on vacation and they're not really paying attention to it. And this is what the NOTAM actually said. It says use ALS and OP, increased RVR and visibility mins, and ALS is the approach lighting system, was out of service for runway 13. So that's going to be, a huge factor in what happens. But this is not what caused them to crash. So I want to be clear about that as well. On the instrument approach plate, you can see here when the ALS is in op, it kind of has that note, increase your RVR to 4,000 and visibility to 3/4 of a mile. But again, if you don't know that the ALS is in op because you didn't brief the NOTAM or you didn't review the NOTAM, then you're probably not going to pay attention to this. But that note is on there when it comes time for the approach. Now, they finish that briefing at 12 o'clock, and then you have about 10 minutes to go get your gear, maybe grab a quick bite to eat if you brought your lunch with you, because you're going to step at 12:10. And a step in the Air Force is when the crew is all going to get together, usually at a duty desk within the squadron, and you're going to figure out which aircraft you're flying, if there's any maintenance codes or write-ups with that aircraft, that sort of thing. And then you're also going to get a step briefing. And this is going to be another slice in the Swiss cheese model that, leads to everything going wrong and ultimately the crash. At the step briefing, you have someone who's called a top 3. Now, the top 3 is essentially a direct representative of the squadron commander and the director of operations. And now his responsibility is he's overseeing the execution of the daily flying schedule just for that squadron. He's going to be doing all the coordination with maintenance. He's going to let you know what aircraft you're going to, coordinate any spare aircraft, maybe if you need to shut down, that sort of thing. And then his other big responsibility is to give you an update on the weather and the airfield conditions. Because if you got the weather, maybe at 9 o'clock when you started your planning effort and you didn't update it, now you've gone into the briefing. Well, it's 3 hours later now, the weather can change significantly, and it had been changing. And so he's going to brief the weather and the airfield conditions. Separate from the top 3, when it comes to the Air Force and how they operate, is someone called the supervisor of flying. Now, the supervisor of flying is an individual who's a direct representative of the group commander. And this guy oversees the flying for the entire base, not just for one squadron. He's usually going to be sitting up in the tower, and he's going to be responsible for liaising with ATC and making decisions on, hey, are we going to cancel, should we cancel flying because of the weather conditions? What's going on with the status of the runways? If an aircraft has an emergency, he's going to help coordinate with air traffic control. He can read you checklists. He can do a lot of things, but he's going to do that all from his position in the tower. And what was going on was the squadron at this base, they had this policy in place. Whenever there was 2 or fewer B-1s flying at the same time, they would combine those duties into one role, and that individual is called the Fox 3. And I kind of laugh at that terminology because it's a term that fighter pilots are familiar with when they're shooting missiles, which the B-1 is not doing, but that's what they called it. So neither here nor there. But this Fox 3, this individual is sitting at the duty desk, and so he's doing both the duties of the top 3 and the SOF. So when he's looking at the weather, he reported to them at their step briefing, hey guys, you're about to go take off. Right now we have a 400-foot ceiling and we have 1.5 miles of visibility. But when you come back to land, all this stuff's going to burn off. You're going to have a 2,500-foot ceiling and 5 miles of visibility. Things are looking a lot better for the return. The problem is this guy's not current on his SOF duties. So although he was current to sit top 3, technically he wasn't current on his SOF duties. It's not a huge deal, but again, it's just one additional factor that's going to contribute to this. And he was also unaware of the NOTAM regarding the ALS, the approach lighting system, being out of service. So he didn't brief that to any of the crews. And then the shocking thing was there was actually a note on his briefing slides about that increased minimum visibility, but that slide was hidden. So he never shared this with anybody. And so you've got 8 guys there getting ready to go out to their aircraft. Multiple opportunities to brief this NOTAM, to see the NOTAM, and still nothing has happened, and it's not briefed. And now they're getting ready to head out to the aircraft. They get out to the aircraft. Things start going okay for Felon 01, the lead aircraft, but Felon 02, the mishap aircraft, starts having some maintenance problems. They stepped at 12:10. They ended up shutting down the engines at 13:52, about an hour and 40 minutes after their step. So that's a long time, to be working, issues, trying to figure things out. And in my opinion, when you're going through an upgrade process, an upgrade in the squadron, like the mishap pilot was, that just adds to a lot of stress to the situation because you're getting evaluated. There's a lot you have, a lot of effort you've put into planning and preparing for this mission. You get out to the aircraft and now you got to shut down. Maybe they don't know if they're going to get another aircraft or not. Are they going to be canceled? So they end up shutting down, and now they're going to go back into the building. And then, hey, guess what? We've got another aircraft for you. You're ready to go. And they get out there and they get the engine started at 15:40. So about 3.5 hours after they originally stepped in the beginning there. And I think that's just, again, it's just adding to the stress. It's adding to the situation. And all of these are just the scenarios building and building as they get closer and closer to this mishap taking place. Start the engines at 15:40. Right after they had engine start, there was a weather update that was issued at 15:55 saying, oh, by the way, when you come back to land, now you're looking at 300-foot ceilings and 1 mile visibility. So between the time they stepped and between the time, they've got the engine started on the second aircraft, the forecast dropped from 2,500 feet and 5 miles down to 300 feet and a mile. Unfortunately, no one told the crew. So they're taking off. And they have no idea how bad the weather is going to be when they go to come back. So that's something that the SOF or the top 3, which is combined in that Fox 3 role, in my opinion, should have been providing that information to the crew and made sure that they were aware of that, because that's going to drive the amount of fuel that they need in terms of the recovery and whether they're going to have divert options available and that sort of thing. Regardless, they took off at 16:14 local. They get out to the airspace. The mission, overall is uneventful. There's nothing much to be said about that. Felon 01 is ready to return to base because they had taken off already. And so remember, they're out there, they're doing their thing, and they're at a lower fuel state by the time Felon 02 arrives. So Felon 02 gets on station, and they still need to return at the same time that they originally planned. So it's just going to be a much shorter mission for them. And that's going to mean that they're returning at a much heavier weight than they anticipated, when it comes to executing the mission. As they're starting that return, they need to get an update on the weather. So what happens? Felon 01 calls Fox 3 on the radio to get a weather update. The problem is he couldn't hear them. Now, They didn't talk about this in the report, but my guess is because typically the radio that's being used by a top 3 individual, which is down in the squadron, it's a very different radio than the radio that's used up in the control tower by the tower controllers. And so it's possible that if this guy had been up in the tower, he might have been able to have better communications with them. And that might have, changed some of the things in terms of how this recovery is affected. Because he couldn't hear what the Fox 3 was saying, Felon 01 tells his wingman, Felon 02, he says, hey, I want you guys to go and get a weather update, figure out what's going on with the weather so we know what we're doing when we're coming back. At this point, Ellsworth Air Force Base is landing on runway 31, and they were able to get the weather data from their electronic flight book, telling them that right now the weather is forecast, or the weather is showing 100-foot overcast and 5/8 miles visibility for runway 31. Obviously very drastically different than the weather that they walked out the door, what they thought it was going to be for the recovery. The METAR gives them a code that says VISNO for runway 13, and VISNO means visibility unavailable. The reason the visibility was unavailable, as they found out afterwards, was that there are 2 weather sensors at the base, one of them near each end of the runway. And on the 2nd of November, so about 2 months prior to the mishap, the horizontal visibility sensor for the one on the end of runway 13, it stopped functioning. Well, when that thing broke, the weather shop didn't provide any formal notice of that to any of the other entities within the operations group prior to the mishap. So they didn't tell the squadrons, they didn't tell anybody else. They also discovered that when this thing broke and they're not able to get the visibility, that if the runway approach lighting remained selected for runway 13, what was happening was somebody from the weather shop would go out there and do manual visibility observations every 20 minutes because you still need to be able to report that visibility. So that's the way they would do it. And in order to minimize the amount of work and effort there was, they knew that the tower would close over the weekend. So if the tower is going to close, they would coordinate with the tower. Hey, tower, why don't you switch the lighting to runway 31? That way, we can always say we're landing 31, even though the tower is closed during the weekends and the holidays. And that way the weather forecaster doesn't have to come in and do a manual observation, and update this weather, even though, because of the tower being closed on the weekend. In terms of the cultural contribution to this and how the culture of the organization was affected this, they discovered the operations support squadron commander, who's oversees the weather shop. He had no idea that this weather sensor was inoperative, even though it met his criteria that said, like, hey, if this breaks, like, you've got to tell me, I'm the commander. But nobody ever told him. And he was also unaware of the arrangement that the weather shop had made with the tower. The tower controllers knew about it, but they didn't have anything documented or any sort of formal procedure to address things if all of a sudden, they were landing runway 31 and somebody wanted to do an opposite direction approach to runway 13. So obviously a lot of different factors playing into all of this. And then to make it worse, you've got the Fox 3 doing a shift change right in the middle of the recovery. So you've got bad weather, you've got an inoperative weather sensor, you've got the NOTAM for the increased visibility minimums, you've got the Fox 3, he's not up in the tower, and now he's doing a shift change. And when the new Fox 3 comes on station, he gets the weather update by consulting with the duty weather forecaster, but he never verified what the visibility is for runway 13. So he gets the information for runway 31. He sees that for runway 13, it's 300 feet overcast, but it's VISNO. And he doesn't question that. He doesn't look into that. And nobody else provides any other information about that. Both of those crews, Felon 01 and 02, that's all the information they have available to them is this last report here. that it's 100-foot overcast on one end of the runway and 5/8 of a mile visibility, and it's 300 feet overcast on the other end, but the visibility is not being reported. Based on all of that information, they make a decision that they're going to fly straight into runway 13, and flying the ILS to runway 13 because it has a higher ceiling, and the visibility requirement on the ILS was a half mile. So they figured they're good, even though the visibility wasn't being reported for runway 13. Neither crew referenced the NOTAM that said they were going to need 3/4 of a mile visibility, and none of them asked about the visibility for runway 13, even though they know that it's not being reported. One of the other factors that they found here as well, just kind of salt in the wound, was they discovered neither crew applied cold weather corrections to their decision altitude. So when the temperature gets below a certain level, you've got to apply corrections to your decision altitude because of how, I'm not going to get into the science of it, but you have to apply corrections. This is Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota. So the average low temperature in January is like minus 10 degrees Celsius or something like that. So this is kind of boggling to me that, they didn't really think about this, that the crew didn't take this into consideration because the temperature outside was minus 5 degrees Celsius. That would have increased their decision altitude by 20 feet. Ultimately, that wouldn't have changed the outcome of this. But again, the AIB is looking at all these different factors and trying to identify, why did this happen? Like, okay, we get everything else with the accident, but here, this is just basic airmanship 101. You've got 8 guys flying this approach, and not a single one of them, brought this up as a consideration for something that they needed to do. The final approach is going to start around 1730 local. They didn't specify what time it began, but I kind of backed things up based on, just experience from timing. And yes, 100% reflective of the lack of attention to detail. Felon 01 begins this approach, and they split the 2 aircraft up. So Felon 01 is going to go first, and then Felon 02 is going to follow, and they're about 7 to 10 mile trail behind them. Felon 01 is going to land without incident. However, when they land, post landing in the interview, they described the conditions as the meanest of men's, but they never communicated those difficult conditions, to their wingmen behind them, saying like, "Hey guys, like that, heads up on the approach, like that was really tight." They never gave them any sort of warning. Additionally, the air traffic control up in the tower was completely in the fog, so they couldn't see the runway that was 5/8 of a mile away. So and the tower controller never relayed those observations to either the weather shop, the Fox 3 individual, or the mishap crew. And I'm not trying to blame the tower. Yes, it would have been nice to have a PIREP. I'm not trying to blame the tower, but if we go back to this, idea of having a top 3 and a soft combined operating from down on the squadron, well, he's sitting at a duty desk in the squadron. He doesn't have direct visibility of outside the window, so he's not seeing how bad the weather is. If this guy had been sitting up in the tower, in my opinion, he would have had much better visibility about what's going on. And he probably would have said like, "Hey, like we can't see anything. What is the real visibility right now? Are these guys going to be good shooting this approach? Like, we really need to take a look at this." And he would have probably talked to the crews on the radio. And my guess is they probably would have all diverted somewhere else, and they wouldn't. Felon 01 wouldn't have even tried to fly the approach. So, I get what the squadron is trying to do in terms of trying to minimize the impact to the manpower in the squadron by combining those duties, since they only have 2 aircraft flying. But you're now starting to see the importance of having an individual up there in the tower that has a certain level of experience that can, help make some of these decisions and direct and oversee the flying operations, if you will. Now, this doesn't, relieve the crew from any of their obligation to do this stuff, but it definitely could have helped, prevent essentially what happened, as you're about to see. Prior to doing that approach, they're going to need to do an approach briefing. Briefings in the Air Force are a little bit different than how the airliners do them. I don't know the specifics for how B-1 crews are instructed to conduct their approach briefing, but what the Accident Investigation Board determined was that when they pulled this from a cockpit voice recorder, so they were able to go back and listen to everything that the crews said to each other. The mishap pilot calculated the approach speed to be 164 knots. So this was the accurate speed, and he did that correctly. There was no issues with that. That was a faster speed than normal because the aircraft was heavyweight due to the early return, and a normal approach speed would have been 152 knots, and that was approximately the speed that Felon 01 flew the approach. You're going to see that speed pop up here in a minute when we look at the data from the charts from the accident. So he briefs the speed. One of the things that they pointed out was he never briefed the vertical velocity required for the approach. It should have been 750 feet per minute. I'm not sure if this is just a B-1 thing. I've never briefed a vertical velocity that's required for an approach that I've flown, but maybe that's something specific to the B-1 community. It obviously was important enough that the AIB made a note of it and said, hey, this is something that he should have briefed. One of the reasons why he should have briefed it is because the OSO and the DSO, remember the two guys sitting behind the pilots, they would have been instructed to monitor that during the approach, but they were never instructed to do that. And they were never told what that vertical velocity should have been. So I guess that's how they back up the pilots on the approach. But if you're a B-1 guy, drop a note in the comments and let me know if I'm getting some of that wrong. So just something to consider there. Other things that are going to be a factor on this approach briefing is the pilot never set his radar altimeter to 200 feet. You would set that radar altimeter to give you a warning or some type of notification when you reach your decision altitude, because that's going to back you up in the event it just falls out of your cross check. Oh my gosh, I'm low altitude. I should probably go around because I don't see the runway right now. So the pilots don't set the radar altimeter. Instead, they left it set on 400 feet, which is completely not helpful to them at all in terms of flying the approach. There's nothing that a 400-foot warning is going to give them. In fact, it can almost, in my opinion, be distracting because you're having your radar altimeter go off at an altitude that has nothing to do with the decision altitude of the approach that you're flying. Additionally, they determined both pilots never set the MSL altitude corresponding to the approach minimums. They had the MSL altitude bug still set at 5,300 feet, which was the final approach fix altitude. So that's not helping them at all in this situation. And to top it all off, remember, this is at night. So you're flying a very challenging approach. This is a hand-flown approach because you got to remember, this is not an airliner. They're not doing some sort of auto land capability with auto throttles sort of thing. The mishap pilot is the guy 15 years junior experience to the instructor. He's the one flying the approach. You've got all these other factors contributing here, and it's a really long day. And you can see how, and they didn't talk about this, so this is just my opinion, how somebody with, not as much experience is kind of deferring to everybody else in the crew in terms of the decisions that he's making in terms of how he's flying this approach. And he's just not getting, any sort of backup or help from the rest of the crew when he goes to begin this approach. And he's got so many things wrong, setting him up essentially for failure when he begins that approach. At night. So they're flying at night, and obviously with the approach briefing, so there's no discussion of what the approach lighting system is going to look like, which is a huge thing as well, because if I'm flying at night, I know I'm shooting this down to 200 feet, and even at 5/8 of a mile visibility or whatever they thought it was, I might want to know what the approach lighting system is going to look like, because that's probably what I'm going to see first when I get below the weather, in order to clue me into where I'm going, and what I can expect for the approach. They also didn't do any go-around briefing or didn't discuss any of the call-outs that they were going to or that they were required to use during the approach. And this is huge. This is something that, for the airline industry, like when you do these approaches, you're going to talk about, hey, what are we going to do if we need to go around? Maybe if we need to execute that go around above 1,000 feet versus doing the go around right at minimums, those procedures are going to be a little bit different. What call outs am I expecting to hear from the pilot monitoring versus the pilot flying? Just a quick rehash of these things is extremely important, especially when you're flying such a challenging approach. They looked at the requirements per their operations procedures, and in a low visibility situation, the OSO, who's sitting back behind the pilots, he was required to call out approaching decision height. The pilot not flying, which is in this case is the instructor pilot, he was required to call out continue, runway in sight, and then when he heard runway in sight, the pilot flying would transition to visual, and then he would call visual when he was visual, and then any crew member at any point can call go around. So if this guy said, in the back says approaching decision height, and he doesn't hear a continue call, well, when they get to their decision altitude, he needs to be saying go around. Somebody needs to be saying go around. This is what they discovered. The only call that was made was the approaching decision height. There was no continue call. There was no runway in sight call made. There was no visual call. And obviously nobody called for the go around because they ended up crashing. 4 guys in that aircraft. It's ridiculous. Why did that happen though? So they looked at the last 55 seconds. Last 55 seconds, and I think this was kind of like, a red herring, if you will. I don't know. I didn't like the way they focused on this, but they said they started that approach in the last 55 seconds. They had a headwind that was 340 at 11 knots, and it shifted to a tailwind of 190 at 5 knots. That happened over a 25-second period, which really isn't that dramatic. And they said that this was performance enhancing wind shear. Now, in the aircraft that I fly, the Airbus 350, if there's wind shear ahead, we're going to get a wind shear ahead warning. We're going to get wind shear alerts, things like that. The B-1 doesn't necessarily have systems that give them that. So it would have been up to the pilots to recognize that change in the winds and the change and the impact that it had on the aircraft in terms of the performance of the aircraft and the airspeed for them to recognize that it was wind shear. So I don't think they necessarily would have done that because, again, this happened over a 25-second period. Usually when you're seeing wind shear, it's over a much shorter time span, just maybe 5 to 10 seconds. And this isn't really like a huge shift. Yes, it is a shift from a headwind to a tailwind, but it's only a shift, from 10 knots to 5 knots. So I don't think it's huge, but because this happens or when it happens, the airspeed starts to increase and the pilot pulls back the power 3 separate times in response. I'm going to show you the chart here so you can see exactly what happened. So I had to add some additional annotations on this chart just to make things a little bit more clear. The blue line is the airspeed that they were at on the approach. The green line that goes all the way straight across in the middle, that is the calculated approach speed that they should have been, which was 164 knots. The red container that I have on here is the period of time where they said the wind shear happened that resulted in a maximum increase of 12 knots to their airspeed. So it says wind shear 12 knots, just means that the airspeed he was at 164 knots and increased to about 176 knots was the max airspeed. When that happens, the pilot recognized it and he starts doing these power reductions. So he does one right in the middle of it as the airspeed is increasing. He does another one shortly after that momentary wind shear, if you will, is over. And then he does one more. And then I made another annotation on here to show you when they were right around 1,000 feet. The reason why I put that 1,000 feet annotation on there is because that is a common definition of where you should be stabilized when flying an approach in the airline industry. So if I'm the pilot monitoring and I'm watching this guy hand fly this approach and we get to 1,000 feet, I'm going to verify that we're cleared to land, but I'm like, hey, you are now 12 knots fast. What are you doing about it? And now I'm probably going to pay a little bit closer attention to what's going on with the airspeed and what he's doing, especially because I know the guy is technically still a student because he's in an upgrade. Yes, he's qualified to fly the B-1, but I'm going to monitor him. So that's my job as the pilot monitoring. I need to back him up. So again, I'm not trying, the blame isn't entirely on the pilot. There's a lot of factors contributing here. When we look at after that, what happens in the last 14 seconds of the flight, the instructor makes a call out. It says lights. And that happens right around the time they're about 250 feet above the ground. So decision altitude is 200 feet. At about 250 feet, the instructor, he's looking outside and he sees the approach lights, which were out of service. So I think he's really seeing the runway lights, but he says lights. So he's seeing some lights out there and he makes the lights call. When he makes that lights call, that's when the pilot flying, he transitions to looking outside. The standard said he needed to keep his eyes focused on the instruments, continue flying the approach, continue staying on parameters until he heard the instructor call, or the pilot monitoring call, runway in sight. But instead, he hears the lights call and he transitions to looking outside. The OSO, who's sitting in the back right, at this point, he's looking across to his left at the altitude on the DSO's display. And I guess that means he didn't have altitude on his display. So he's trying to look over across on the other display to see what's going on, to monitor the approach. The DSO said, he told the investigators, hey, I wasn't monitoring the approach. I was reviewing the after landing checklist, which is, obviously the wrong time in a critical phase of flight when you're about to land. Like, there's no reason you need to be reviewing the after landing checklist right now, especially if one of your primary jobs is to back up, the guys up front. So everyone has some blame in this, not just the pilot flying. So I'm not trying to point fingers at any one individual. There are multiple people that were involved here. And I appreciate the note here. When the air crew gets quiet, the air crew is getting behind the plane. And I couldn't agree more. And feel like if they didn't provide a copy of the cockpit voice recorder, but I get the sense that there just wasn't a lot of communication happening during this approach, especially as they're getting lower and lower to the ground. And like, if I'm sitting in the back, like the hair on the back of my neck is standing up probably. If like I'm letting these guys fly this approach, I have no idea how they're going to fly it, what we're going to do for a go around or anything like that. And I'm not monitoring what they're doing. So again, just a lot of different things. No one's monitoring the flight parameters. During that last 14 seconds, the airspeed decreased to 152 knots. Remember, that would have been the correct approach speed if they had taken off on time and been the same fuel state as Felon 01. And if that had happened, then probably this accident never would have happened. They would have been right on speed by the time they're about to land. But instead, now they're slow. So 10 seconds before impact, the other issue was he was a half dot below glide slope. So he's low on the approach. They're getting close to the ground. The vertical velocity, which should have been 750 feet per minute, increased to 1,800 feet per minute. 4 seconds to impact. That's when the instructor yells out, climb, climb, climb. Nothing happens. 2 seconds to impact. The instructor yells out, climb. And it's at that point that the mishap pilot finally tries to execute a go around. So again, he doesn't say go around, he just says climb. That initial touchdown happened about 100 feet prior to the runway 13 overrun. And you can see the part of the approach lighting system that was inoperative. It's there. It was, taken out by the wheels when they touched down. When this happens, the aircraft goes dark because that initial impact, for some reason, caused a complete power loss inside the aircraft. So now it's at night, completely dark. You just slammed into the ground. No one commands the ejection. There's no bailout call. Instead, they start, skidding across the runway. And you can see the track that they went on there. And the mishap pilot pulls the ejection handles, and that's what starts the ejection sequence. Again, they all 4 eject safely, but that instructor pilot was rendered unconscious, most likely because of him being overweight, exceeding the limits of the ejection seat. one of the shocking things that they discovered when they were running back and looking at all the data from this is they found that if the crew had executed a go around from 180 feet, which was 20 feet below the decision altitude. So if for some reason somebody had caught it at the last second, crap, we're at decision altitude. Wait a minute, we did. Oh, let's go around. If somebody had called for that, they would have been able to execute a go around safely and still, got as low as I think they said about 50 feet above the ground using only mill power. So without even using the afterburner, they would have been able to recover. A lot to talk about. Even though they all survived the ejection, they very easily could have died doing this approach because of how dangerous this was. The full report, you can get it off the Air Force website, but it's also on Discord under the final report section. Just click on the picture of the B-1. So I highly recommend going through that report. There's a few more details in there that I didn't have time to talk about. And although the pilot is ultimately the one flying the aircraft, so responsible for the safe operation of the aircraft, you've got an experienced instructor who is likely the aircraft commander or acting aircraft commander for the mission. And you can see how all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up. And it wasn't just any one person's fault that this happened. And this was just a very scathing report from the AIB in terms of who they said was to blame for this. And I think somebody made a comment earlier that one of the commanders of one of these organizations was relieved of command. I don't know if that's true or not. It's not my job to criticize any one individual. I just wanted to share what happened with everyone because there's so many good lessons that we can take away from this when it comes to how the culture of your organization or your airline or whoever you're working for can change over time. And it's a little thing here, a little thing there, and they start to add up over and over. And then eventually, holes in the Swiss cheese lined up. And I think this is another really good example of how important it is to review the weather and NOTAMs before you go fly, especially for guys that are doing cross-country flights. We see that a lot of times happen on GA flights, and the departure, but they don't check the weather between. They don't bother to talk to the controllers to get weather updates, things like that. So there's just a lot of stuff there. And again, with the NOTAMs, I know those are a pain sometimes to read because of how the NOTAM system is designed, but you got to look through that stuff, especially when it comes to the critical things that could impact your ability to safely take off or depart from an airfield. All that being said, I appreciate you guys sticking around. I know it's been a long debrief and a little bit different than the other ones that I've done. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a channel member or join me over on Patreon. And thanks so much for sticking around. I will stick around for a little bit longer here to answer any questions anyone has that I didn't get to earlier. Sticks, I don't know if you have any of those, but if you don't want to stick around for that, I appreciate y'all.
So Hoover, if it's okay, I just actually jumped in here on the stage because actually I did see a couple of questions. I think one of the things that I did see as a trend, there was a lot of questions of how is it that 4 pilots or 4 aircrew members in the aircraft could actually contribute to this?
Well, I think when we look at this, everybody, you have a responsibility. Every crew member is going to have a different role. They have different responsibilities when it comes to flying the aircraft, right? You can't just put this all on the pilot flying the plane. If he's relying on his instructor, or even if the guy wasn't an instructor, if he's relying on the other pilot to make certain call outs and to perform, what we would call in the airline industry pilot monitoring duties, then that guy has to do those duties. Now, is it his job to still, fly the approach and do what he's supposed to do? Yes, but he's got somebody that's backing him up, and he also has 2 other guys behind him that are supposed to be backing him up as well. And that goes back to a little bit to his approach briefing. But I think it's also a lot of it is the pressure of the situation, being the young guy trying to do the upgrade, and you've got all these other, people that you're thinking are backing you up, but maybe they're not. And it's just, I don't know. I think this was probably just a rusty crew coming back from the holiday break, January 4th, everybody's okay. This is just going to be an easy flight. We're going to go out there and it's going to be low threat. We're just going to get this done. We're not going to worry about it. So they kind of it felt like they kind of just blew off the concerns about the weather and initially trusted, the forecaster. Hey, the weather is crappy right now. I know it's crappy, but it'll burn off later today. Well, guess what? Even if he's telling me that, I'm paying attention to that and getting updates on that and making sure it's going to be good, because I need to manage that in terms of my fuel state. Because if I do get back and it's really bad, I might need to divert, so you've got all 4 people on that aircraft should be able to easily manage all of that for a basic instrument approach. And it just didn't happen.
Right. I picked up on a certain degree of complacency, as well as I think fatigue factored in as well. The delays at the beginning and a desire to, if you're in an upgrade syllabus, there's some pressure to get the check in the box. And with that, you then get missionitis becomes a factor, and you have a tendency to try to push things when you shouldn't be.
Yeah. And this wasn't a challenging flight. It wasn't a very long flight. It was a long duty day, but I don't think it was anything that longer than what they would have otherwise expected. This wasn't like an abnormally long mission for them. B-1s have done much longer missions than this.
Absolutely.
So this was it was probably in their mind like a short mission,
Okay.
I don't know. I'm not a B-1 guy, but it's a couple hour mission. They're taking off. I think whatever the time was, like 1600 or ish or whatever. They're taking off and they're landing, a couple hours later. So, but they're landing after sunset. So it's just all these different factors that are contributing to this, and how this built up. And the other part of it, that we've talked about, but it's just how the organization itself. One of the things that I didn't mention is they talked about the director of operations in this accident report, how whenever there's bad weather, I just remember from a fighter squadron, the director of operations, when there's bad weather going on and the director of operations is not flying, it's kind of his operation in the squadron, and so his desk is usually, or his office is usually pretty close to where the top 3 desk is when these crews are getting their step briefs. And, a good DO is going to be out there when these guys are going to step, making sure they have all the information they need, making sure the top 3 is giving them, a good briefing, making sure they have all these updates, because he's probably, the DO is probably looking outside and going, man, this weather sucks. What are my crews going to do? And are they going to be able to come back safely? Because, these are our aircraft for the squadron. We need to make sure we've got a plan for this. And I might want to remind the guys, hey guys, I know you just got back. Maybe it's your first flight, just coming back. Be safe out there. The weather's not looking the best today. And here's what you might need to want to keep in mind for your recovery. Oh, by the way, we need higher visibility for this. And hey, top 3, if the weather starts to get worse, let me know, because I might send you up to the tower to help out with this, and I'll sit here at the top 3 desk. But instead, the DO admitted he was basically checking emails and working on admin, when all this happened. So
when I was still flying for the Coast Guard, one of the things I always used to, if I was going out on a mission, I tried to have benchmarks and checkpoints where if I was at a certain parameters with certain weather, okay, maybe we need to think about a divert. And this way you're just not losing that situational awareness. And it feels like at some point they lost their situational awareness.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing about situational awareness is you usually don't know you've lost it until somebody else tells you.
Right. And that's where, I always got nervous when things got really quiet in the cockpit. So
a couple other questions on here in terms of, when a crew comes back. I don't know what the B-1 guys do for a Strike Eagle guy. If I'm just off for, 2 weeks or whatever, over the Christmas holiday, we're going to come back and we're going to, just do kind of like a vanilla mission, if you will, something not as challenging. We're not going to jump right into a very complex, 4 versus 4, with refueling and everything else going on. So I don't think they do simulators or anything to freshen up, because I don't necessarily think it's needed. But, in terms of the operational risk management calculations that factor into the flight, this is all something that the instructor And then he's got, again, the OSO, who's a weapons school graduate. He should be smart enough to kind of think about these things, even though he is not one of the pilots. Like, it's still something that, probably should have been in his mind as well, for all of this. So.
There was a question here about the military practice using crew resource management. The answer to that is absolutely. That's a huge piece of all military aviation training, beginning from the moment you step into flight school.
And you get regular training, regular CRM training as well.
You have to do refresher training.
That covers all this stuff. Now, I can promise you that the SIB report, which is not available to the public, but the SIB report for this, I guarantee is going to have some additional lessons that are going to be shared within the B-1 community. And some of those might be shared, with certain other communities. I mean, this is the thing about like an SIB report. If I fly maybe a KC-135, I might not ever see this report because it might have nothing to do with KC-135 operations, right? So just because you're in the military and in a flying position, that also doesn't necessarily mean you'll have access to those reports or see those. So, some people have said that this report is probably as scathing as the Fairchild B-52 crash that happened back, I think that was 92 or 94. I can't remember, back in the day. And I remember like that crash was one that was, briefed multiple times at different safety briefings over the years, when I was in the service. And this will probably be one that it'll be the same thing. It'll probably get briefed multiple times over the next several years, because I guarantee every squadron commander that is looking at this, that wants to take care of their people, is going, how are we running operations, and are we doing them in a safe manner? And what is my director of operations doing? What are their qualifications for the people sitting behind the desk that are briefing my crews that are going to fly? And how are we managing our aircraft?
Absolutely. I think there was a lot more with that Fairchild B-52 crash. There was a lot more, the term I would use would be vicious compliance. And it was just a complete disregard. And it had just been so many kicked down the road so many times of the pilot who really did not belong in the cockpit. But, this one strikes me, there's certainly huge breakdown in, best practices, but, I see some big differences between the two events, but there's a lot of similarities too. So,
yeah. I was just saying, just from a perspective of like how widespread this briefing is probably going to become, over the next few years. This will be the one that replaces the B-52 crash, and thankfully, like I said, nobody died from this. I think they were very lucky, because it very easily, like if the visibility, or if the if he hadn't seen the runway lights, like who knows, but basically you've got that. When the instructor calls lights, the pilot is for some reason, he transitioning to flying visual. He should have stayed on his instruments until he heard the runway and sight call. And then he looks up, okay, there's the runway. Now I'm going to go ahead and land. Now, something I didn't talk about because I didn't really know too much about this for the B-1 community, but I don't know if you're aware how like the Air Force has pilot weather categories. Have you ever heard this?
I have, yeah.
Okay. So for those that aren't aware, the Air Force has in certain communities, and I don't know if it's like, single pilot aircraft or whatnot, because I've been out of it for a few years now. So I can't recall the specifics, but I know in the Strike Eagle community, you're going to have different pilot weather categories. And this is just one way that they manage the risk when you show up in a squadron and you're new to the aircraft. And what it entails, it's like, I think it's PWC pilot weather category 5 all the way down to 1. And most guys will end up getting pilot weather category 2, I think ends up being probably the highest that you get. And what it does is they say, okay, well, if you're new to the squadron, if you have less than a certain number of hours, we're going to start you off at pilot weather category 4 or whatever. And what that means is you can't fly unless the weather is better than 1,003 or something. I'm just throwing numbers out there. And then you're very quickly going to transition to pilot weather category 3, which I think is 500 foot ceiling and a half mile, or maybe it's 500 and a mile, something like that. And then eventually you're going to transition. I think it's after like maybe 300 hours or something, or maybe it's 500 hours. You're going to transition to pilot weather category 2. And that's going to allow you to fly For the Strike Eagle, it let us go down to 301 or the published approach minimums, whichever was higher. So even if the ILS minimums were 200.5, we could still only fly the approach legally per the Air Force if the weather was 301. And it's just a way they manage risk, because you have to remember you're hand flying these approaches. You're not coupling the autopilot. It's not an auto land. These aircraft, they don't have the RNAV, LPV, type approach capability that modern aircraft have. And so these guys are hand flying these approaches, and there's no reason to try to hand fly an approach down to minimums of 200 feet and half-mile visibility, like in my opinion, unless you're in a combat type of situation. And that's kind of what the Air Force has done, and that's why they created these pilot weather categories. And the only reason we would fly an approach down to those minimums is out in combat. If you're in training, we're just going to cancel flying for the day if we don't have the weather. Or maybe if you're a junior guy, I'm going to make sure I put an instructor pilot in your back seat or flying with you to back you up, and you'll operate off of his pilot weather category.
Right.
So I don't know if that was the case here, right? Because they didn't talk about that. Maybe they were operating off of the instructor's weather category and not his, or maybe they don't even use them at all in that community. I don't know, but it's just something to think about, because it's just one more way of managing risk.
It's kind of funny because on the Coast Guard side, so we do have, like, there's a risk or a progression through the syllabus. You come in, you're first co-pilot, then you progress to first pilot, then aircraft commander, and then instructor pilot. But so a first pilot could still fly a search and rescue mission, but it'd have to be under VFR conditions, but a aircraft commander, you're going to be able to take on any mission. But it's kind of funny. The Coast Guard doesn't necessarily cancel missions for weather, but that's just the nature of our operation.
Well, yeah, but this is the Air Force. We got golf to play and other things to do. So,
all right.
Well, last question I want to get to here. How can you get a waiver to exceed the max weight of an aircraft or of an ejection seat? And I don't know the exact answer on that. My understanding is, it's just like anything, right? Like the ejection seat manufacturer is going to come out and say, like, here's what we guarantee the seat capability to. And then through testing and stuff that the Air Force or whoever does, they might look at this and go, okay, well, they've padded that number by a certain percentage, so we'll give you a waiver, to fly as long as your weight is still under this. And in this case, what was it, like 245 pounds or something? And what they found with this guy's medical records is they said, and his examinations or the different medical checkups that he had done, in the months or year or whatever leading up to this mishap, at least one time he self-reported his weight being 245. So to me, that indicates he knew exactly what the limit was. And he said, hey, this is what I weigh, but nobody was ever, checking it. And the medical records, according to the board, didn't show him being overweight. It just showed, hey, at least one time he wrote on the form. I think that's what they mean by self-reported. He must have filled it out himself and said, oh, I'm only 245 pounds.
Yeah.
Now, in his mind, he's probably just, hey, I just want to fly and I'm not going to worry about this, because the odds of me ejecting from a B-1 probably really low, but
right.
Here we go. So,
all right.
All right. I don't think there was any other questions like there were.
I think we covered most of them, and I apologize. I stuck my head in just at the end to sort of play person for you to bounce questions off of, but I know
you're good. Guys, meet Styx if you haven't met Styx, and he'll probably be around for some of the future live streams to help out. And obviously, he's got a Coast Guard helo background there,
right.
So, anyways, if you're catching this on the replay, or if I didn't get to your question, go ahead and make sure to put it in the comments below, not in the live stream chat, but put it as a comment on the video, and I'll go back and check those later on. Thanks so much for sticking around. Appreciate your support, and we'll see you on the next debrief.
Take care.